still in this study of Christianity and anti-Semitism. And just as a way of review, I had presented, well, 2 weeks back I had asked the question, why do people hate the Jews? And we had various answers provided. I'm trying to take this study in the direction of Christianity's historic anti-Semitic attitude toward the Jewish people. And one of the reasons why some people, some critics, will explain the historic anti-Semitism you found within Europe over the centuries is a result of where they put the finger or point the finger to the Christian church. So after I had asked the question, why do people hate the Jews? And there were several, and there's not just one. But I wanted to take this study and look at how the Christian church factors into this as potentially one reason why there is so much anti-Semitism, as odd as that sounds. So then I kind of changed the question, why do Christians hate the Jews? And here's the answer I just had made reference to, because the New Testament portrays the Jews as being hostile to Jesus and his followers. And then I had brought, I think, 8 different, I don't want to say questions, but possible cases or arguments that are brought forth by critics who put the blame, some of the blame of anti-Semitism on the Christian church. So there were 8 arguments that were presented, and I shared these with you, and I had asked if anyone here agrees with these statements, please raise your hand. So those who were here last week, hopefully you'll remember that. We did have a bit of a, I don't want to say a tussle, but there was a little reluctance. When I had raised these questions or put these points and arguments up on the screen, there was some reluctance to agree with them. And the first one I had put up was the Jews were responsible for crucifying Jesus. And I said, raise your hands if you believe the Jews were culpable / responsible for crucifying Jesus. And there was a lot of hesitation about this one. Randy fortunately spoke up, because very few people raised their hands. And he pointed out from Acts 2, starting verse 22, this verse, men of Israel, hear these words, Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know, this Jesus delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you. And who's the you here? The men of Israel. Another way to refer to the men of Israel, what term could we use? The Jews. Okay. You men of Israel, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. Okay. So there was some real hesitation to raise your hand on this one. I don't know if I were to take the same survey this morning, how many people would raise their hands? Were the Jews responsible or culpable for crucifying Jesus? Raise your hand if you believe the Bible teaches that the Jews were culpable. Okay? I still see some hesitancy. I kind of wondered, I thought back about this, is it like, are we reluctant because we feel like if we answer yes, we're going to be labeled anti-Semitic? Is that part of the hesitation? Because we'll go on. There was one in a passage in 1 Thessalonians we'll get to later that makes it even more clear. Daniel?
I think some of the hesitancy here too is just the fact that like we're looking at like thousands of years here, so it's, to say that like the Jews, like a blanket statement, it's like, well, like this group of Jews at this time. And again, like I know I'm kind of splitting hairs here, but I think that's something where I'm kind of hesitant to be comfortable with these blanket statements on this demographic of people, also over thousands of years past then.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, you would agree if I were to say in the year 33 AD, were the Jews responsible or culpable for crucifying Jesus? Would that be a better question to ask than to just simply say the Jews, which leaves it an open like 2,000 years, the Jews? Is that where you're kind of drawing a line that you hesitate to raise your hand because it sounds like the Jews, you haven't defined the Jews. You're talking about the Jews from Jesus' time all the way up to today.
You didn't get together and say at that time, like, we are comfortable with this accusation for Jesus, and like, so it's like a small group of them or a group of them. Just like when you make generalizations about like Americans, so it's like, well, like that's a lot of people with differing beliefs.
Right, but if you remember the context of these points, it was the critics are pointing to the New Testament. Okay, so we're looking at a narrow point in time. We're not talking about 2,000 years. We're talking about within the pages of the New Testament. Does the New Testament portray the Jews as being culpable for crucifying Jesus? So perhaps I needed to kind of clarify what the argument is. You make an excellent point. You need to define, the time period. Would it be true that the New Testament portrays the Jews, the men of Israel, as being culpable for crucifying or putting Jesus to death? Randy?
The answer is yes.
Okay.
And I use for my reference Acts 3, verse 17. After he talks about Christ, he says, "And now, brethren," speaking to the Jews, "I know that through ignorance you did it, as did also your rulers." So he was going beyond the rulers when he makes that statement.
I'm in a little different place, and I was reluctant to raise my hand because it depends on who is he talking to. Like if I was talking to the people in this room, I'm saying we're all going to go to lunch together. Well, that's everybody I'm talking to, not everybody on the streets, not everybody is a Christian or anything like that. And I think of people like, do we include like Mary, his mother, in this? You might be splitting hairs, but that's why I think it's the party that he was talking to were probably involved and had that.
Okay, so again,
I don't want to split hairs.
what I'm trying to do is identify within the New Testament, does the New Testament portray the Jews as being responsible and culpable for crucifying Jesus? Jason?
I think when we take a look at Daniel's prayer in Daniel chapter 9, you get an example of what you're talking about. So Daniel, when he prays in Daniel chapter 9, he is confessing in general for the wicked deeds of the people of Israel. Though he in particular wasn't responsible or a part of the wickedness that led up to the Babylonian conquest and subsequent diaspora, right? So they're all in Babylon at the time. But when he makes his prayer in Daniel chapter 9, it's a lot of we and us, and even though he in particular is not culpable of those things. So when you ask your question, are the Jews? Yes. In the same way that Daniel acknowledges some portion of that wickedness of the people of Israel, which made them go to Babylon.
Okay. Fair enough. Here's the other passage I was referring to in 1 Thessalonians. And honestly, I understand the hesitation. I totally understand. However, here's, Randy's presented 2 verses already. Here's one more. For you, brothers, became imitators of the churches of God in Christ Jesus that are in Judea. For you suffered the same things from your own countrymen as they did from the Jews. The Jews who killed both the Lord Jesus and the prophets and drove us out and displeased God and opposed all mankind. So my question has been, is the New Testament identifying the Jews as being culpable or responsible for crucifying Jesus? okay? I understand the hesitancy to blame, 2,000 years worth of Jews. I understand that. But if you're reading these words, could you not say yes to the question or the argument that's being presented by the critics that points a finger to the New Testament as being part of the anti-Semitism that would then develop, which we haven't gotten to? Okay, so that's what I'm trying to hone in on, is does the New Testament have specific language that identifies the Jewish people as being responsible?
I think it's like peeling layers of an onion. And yes, the people that are opposing the Jews can very simply look at this and blanket all Jews for their hatred. But, if we peel an onion back, initially it was the leaders, a small sect of the Jewish leaders that wanted to condemn Jesus. And from that, they made the statement, let his blood be on us and our children. So that's another layer of it. And I think that's what is being presented here in Scripture. So, ultimately, it is out of the acts of the leaders, Jews are responsible. But
No, okay. So here's the point. If you're on the outside and you're looking at this from a sociological standpoint, and you were to go back to the New Testament writings, could you, as a sociologist, as a historian, find verses that lay the blame of Jesus' death on the Jews? That's what we're looking at, what I'm trying to discuss. This is in the context of what critics bring forward to accuse the church as far as being anti-Semitic. And they will point to passages like this. So I totally get what you're saying. We're not talking, the entire nation of Israel didn't crucify Jesus. I get that. But if you're from the outside and you're trying to figure out where anti-Semitism, you can trace it back in time, and you look at these writings. I mean, again, I think I mentioned last week, anti-Semitism or hatred toward people doesn't occur because, someone calls them a bad name. It's because there's a story, there's a narrative, there's something being told about that group of people. The New Testament is that narrative, is that story. So when a sociologist, a historian looks back and he finds the story, he can point to this passage, he can point to Acts 2, Acts 3. That's all I'm trying to do, is say, if you're looking from the outside, the New Testament can give you reason to say that you have anti-Semitism, that the ground is fertile. The New Testament, the Christian church, has this the antagonism that's beginning to develop, that you have the wording that can be taken in a negative way down the road. It doesn't have to lead to that, but it did. So what we're doing is trying to go back in time and figure out where does the anti-Semitism that has been found in the Christian church, where did it originate from? And this type of verse, Acts 2, Acts 3, are where the critics will point. So that's where I'm coming from, okay? Now, if we go back and skip back to number 2, because I know this number 2 was also an issue. And I just wanted to elaborate on this one. So I had asked, the tribulations of the Jewish people for the last 20 centuries are God's punishment on the for the Jewish rejection of Jesus. Again, there was a lot of hesitation to raise your hand here. However, I mentioned this last week. I didn't have these verses up, but I made reference to Deuteronomy 28. And if you turn there, Deuteronomy 28, it goes on for like 50-some verses. And the first, maybe 1/5, the very beginning, it's talking about all the blessings, or part of the blessings that the people of Israel would encounter if they obeyed God's voice. But then things flip, and we get the negative side, the dark side. And starting at verse 15, we find this: but if you will not obey the voice of the Lord your God, or be careful to do all his commandments and his statutes that I command you today, then all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. Cursed shall you be in the city, cursed shall you be in the field, cursed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl, cursed be the fruit of your womb, and the fruit of your ground, the increase of your herds, and the young of your flock. Cursed shall you be when you come in, and cursed shall you be when you go out. And it goes on and on and on and on. There's like 53 more verses of these curses. And what is this all based upon? If the people of Israel will not obey the voice of the Lord your God. Now, what is the voice of the Lord your God? How do we understand that? How do we define the voice of the Lord? How do we hear the voice of the Lord? How does it become manifest?
If you're going back to the first century again, it was by repenting and listening to the message of the apostles. It didn't matter if they're individually responsible for the crucifixion of Christ. He gave them 40 years to repent and join the new covenant.
Okay, well, I'd go even back a little bit further. Let's go back to Jesus. Okay, you mentioned the apostles. Let's go back to Jesus. Let's flip to Deuteronomy 18. See if I can read up there. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen. And the Lord said to me, they are right in what they have spoken. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers. And this is, of course, Moses and God having this exchange. And then I highlighted this, and I, referring to God, I will put my words in his mouth. Whose mouth? The prophet that will be raised up like Moses, who is a reference to what? Jesus. I will put my words in Jesus' mouth, in the Messiah's mouth, and he, the Messiah, shall speak to them all that I, God, command them. And whoever will not listen to my words, that he, Jesus, or the Messiah, shall speak in my name, I myself will require of him, or the individual who doesn't hear. Okay, so if you take this and tie it back to these curses, the voice of the Lord your God, I would be fair to say, could be explained or understood as being, in the first century, Jesus of Nazareth. Randy?
But that was a big question on their minds. Was Jesus this prophet talked about in Deuteronomy? You can find several verses that say, is he this prophet, or is he the prophet, or it's not just calling him the Messiah, they're calling him the prophet.
Yeah, is this the prophet? You know, and was he the prophet? Hopefully everyone here says yes. So can we not say that if you will not obey the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, all these curses shall come and overtake you?
I would just add that I think Hebrews chapter 1 actually builds your case as well, because it says, God, who at sundry times and in diverse manners spoke in times past unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son.
Okay. So what I'm trying to do is, back to the second argument that is presented or put forward by critics. Again, I'm not making this up, okay? I'm just simply presenting the case. We started with, why do people hate the Jews? That went to, why do Christians hate the Jews? And I'm presenting what critics from the outside point to as one explanation why there has been historically anti-Semitism within the Christian church. So argument 2 was that the tribulations of the Jewish people through the last 20 centuries are God's punishment for the Jewish rejection of Jesus. So what I've been trying to do with Deuteronomy 28:18, and what David is saying, what Randy is saying, is link Jesus as being the voice of the Lord your God. And if you reject the voice of Jesus, you're rejecting the voice of the Lord your God. Ergo, or therefore, all these curses will come upon you. Okay?
To go along with that too, even like one of the first instances where God is explaining who he is to Moses, he says, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children's children in the third and fourth generation. So there's that idea of generational punishment through lineage there too that could be material for that.
Yeah, and then of course we have in Matthew where we have that unfortunate scene, I think it's Matthew, where Pilate is trying to let Jesus off the hook and have Barabbas, crucified. And then the people say, no, crucify Jesus and let his blood be upon us and upon our children. So there we have even an additional kind of like linkage to the generations that would follow. But even still, each individual, whether you be Jew or Gentile, if God is speaking through his Son and you hear his voice and you reject it, I understand these curses are speaking specifically to the people of Israel, but it's honestly applicable to a Gentile. If you're going to reject the voice of the Lord your God, you are rejecting eternal life, and the only option is then death. So, if we now look at the second argument, could we not be a little bit more comfortable with raising our hand to the argument that the tribulations of the Jewish people through the last 20 centuries are God's punishment for the Jewish rejection of Jesus? Is that an unreasonable criticism to put forward as for why the Jewish people have been mistreated within the Christian church? Jason?
Along with that, you also have to take the understanding that God says to Abraham, I will bless those that bless thee and curse those that curse thee. So alongside of Israel's punishment is, as you watch that, God says in other prophets, don't say, aha, see that great thing that God is doing to you. No, it should inspire us to tremble, to say, what an awesome and powerful God. He's looking after his people Israel. I want to bless Israel, even though God is punishing Israel at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, that's where unfortunately, the bus or the train runs off the rails with regards to Christianity. And, Paul even warned us not to become high-minded. Just because the natural branch has been broken off and we've been grafted in, we're not supposed to become proud and puffed up. But that's what happened to the Christian church. And unfortunately, it led to anti-Semitism. It didn't have to follow. I think that's what you're saying, that just because God punishes a people doesn't mean we were going to pile on. I think, I'm trying to remember when Babylon sacked Jerusalem, who was it, the Edomites? Who would say, raise it, like, go ahead, keep on, let's do it. That's not the proper attitude. I think, who was the prophet later that criticized Edom in the day of Jacob's trouble, that she was there, egging on the destruction? Obadiah, okay,
We have
thank
two
you.
Obadiahs.
So it does not follow that if God punishes a group of people, in this case the children of Israel, it doesn't mean we pile on and say, I hate them too, That is not, it does not follow, but unfortunately it did follow if you look back at the Christian history. All right, so I'm not going to do this for all these. I'm going to flip forward. So there were 7, maybe there was 8. Maybe I should read some of these again. The children of Israel are God's original chosen people by virtue of an ancient covenant, but by rejecting Jesus, they forfeited their chosenness. And now, by virtue of a new covenant, Christians have replaced the Jews as God's chosen people, the church having become the people of God. It's kind of like successionist thinking, and we'll get into that term later. The Old Testament repeatedly portrays the opaqueness and stubbornness of the Jewish people and their disloyalty to God. The Old Testament contains many predictions of the coming of the Jesus Messiah, yet the Jews were blind to the meaning of their own Bible. I think most of us agreed to that, didn't have any problem with that. By the time Jesus' ministry, Judaism is portrayed as having ceased to be a living faith and is depicted as restrictive and burdensome legalism. And Judaism that emerged after the destruction of the temple, and which we find today, is depicted as being little more than the religion of the Pharisees, that is, predecessors of the rabbis, who Jesus pointed out having their teachings and behavior were little more than hypocrites and blind leaders of the blind. So these 8 points, actually, I got from this particular article. Again, I did not make up those points. I wasn't the one who dreamed them up. I am sharing these because critics will point to the New Testament as one explanation for where the rabid anti-Semitism came from that we find or found in the subsequent centuries in Europe. So I don't know if you can see it, the title of this article is Anti-Semitism in the New Testament. It goes into more detail about the things I just shared with you. And you can see at the bottom, I don't have the page, 1, 2, 3 there at the bottom of the screen. So again, I did not come up with these.
Brother Phil, Paul Martin had a couple different comments to things. We didn't notice it until just now, but he's talking about in Luke 19, verse 41 through 44, it says, "And when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, Would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around and surround you and hem you on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave you one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation." And he says, Jesus told them, "Which of the prophets didn't your fathers kill? And they are blinded until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled."
Right. So there we even have, again, blame being put upon that generation, or the rabbinic, or the religious leaders, being blamed for the death of the prophets that preceded them. All right, so you know now where I got that and where I was coming from, why I was presenting it. Now, I had shared this just shortly, not too long ago. I'm not going to go over this again, talking about how the Jews killed both the Lord Jesus and the prophets, et cetera, et cetera. It's pretty tough language. It says, "The wrath of God has come upon them at last." Again, we're kind of tying back to the Deuteronomy 28 passage. Now, last week, I added this, how Paul then makes reference to, "and Satan hindered us." And this is only, the subsequent the two verses that follow the passage above. And I presented that it is a reasonable deduction to say that the Satan that Paul's referring to are in fact the Jewish religious establishment that he actually was at one time part of, that was trying to snuff out Christianity. And then I want you to just remember, we now have not only the death of Jesus being tied to the Jews, but the Jews are being associated with a term called Satan. Okay? Now, I know we have our understanding of Satan, but if we're talking about mainstream Christianity, Satan is that dude who was kicked out of heaven and has led, a team of angels and evil angels who are just busy causing chaos in the world. So I'm going to show you a video, hopefully we won't run out of time, and when you watch that video, just keep in mind there's a difference between how we understand Satan and how Christianity understands Satan. Now, I want to jump ahead to John chapter 8, but you'll see how this ties in with the video. I think we've got a little bit more time. So this is John 8. This is the passage where Jesus is at the treasury, and he's talking to the religious leaders. "I know that you are the offspring of Abraham, yet you seek to kill me because my word finds no place in you. I speak of what I have seen with my father, and you do what you have heard from your father." They answered, "Abraham is our father." Jesus said to them, "If you were Abraham's children, you would be doing the works of Abraham. But now you seek to kill me, a man who has told you the truth that I heard from God." Getting back to that, the prophet, that God would put the words into the prophet's mouth. This is not what Abraham did, or a man who told you the truth that I heard from God. This is not what Abraham did. You are doing the works of your father. You are doing the works your father did. They said to him, "We were not born of sexual immortality. We have one Father, even God." Jesus said to them, "If God were your father, you would love me, for I came from God and I am here. I came not of my own accord, but he sent me. Why do you not understand what I say? It's because you cannot bear my words. You are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he's a liar and the father of lies. All right, so now we have a link to the devil. We had Satan in 1 Thessalonians. Now we have offspring of the devil. Notice, you probably weren't paying attention, but these are the references to who Jesus was talking about. And notice it says, of course, it starts out with the Pharisees, but then it goes to, and this is the passage we just read, so the Jews said, and then Jesus said to the Jews. And then we have, you are of your father the devil. Then we have the Jews answer him, the Jews said to him, so the Jews said to him. Okay. You notice the Jews, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews. You are of your father the devil. Okay. I know what Jesus was referring to, but if you're reading this from an outside perspective, you could point to this, John chapter 8, as also being a potential source of anti-Semitism if you're linking the devil with a group of people, the Jews. All right, now we have one more. This is from Revelation, chapters 2 and 3. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those that say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. And then in chapter 3, behold, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say they are Jews and are not, but lie, behold, I will make them come and bow down before your feet, and they will learn that I have loved you. Now, this is Jesus speaking, and I think for this to make sense, you need to consider Romans 2, verse 29, which says, but a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God. If you do that, you'll understand that, in fact, the people that are saying they are Jews are, in fact, Jews. They're Jews by birth, by race. Okay? But Jesus is using Romans, the standard of Romans 2, that a Jew is one who's a Jew inwardly. It's an inward disposition of the heart. But notice, the point I want to get across is now we have yet another instance where Satan is being linked to the Jews. Okay? Now, I'm going to show you this video, and hopefully all this will start to make more sense. This is presented by a rabbi. Okay, we've lost our audio. Well, then maybe we won't. Anyway, this video, this rabbi, he actually touches on the two passages, two of the three passages I just shared with you, 1 Thessalonians and the John chapter 8. And he wants to share with us how the Jewish people view these passages and how historically it has created a problem for the Jewish people. There's no hope of getting any audio? Put it on what? On recording? Well, I mean, people here aren't going to be able to watch it on YouTube. I'm talking about, can we get audio to the speakers? Well, I don't know if you can get Walter. We can just pause it and go on to the next slide. But it really is helpful. At least we got PowerPoints up here. Get too upset. So let's see, where was I? Got kind of thrown off here. Okay, so what I wanted to do next is go back to this article on anti-Semitism in the New Testament. One thing that they point out is that the book of John in particular is singled out by critics as being the most anti-Semitic of all the books you find in the New Testament. And it's interesting, the logic, the argument they bring forward, I will later criticize it, but I just want to present it first. So for this to make sense, we get back to this term, the Jews. Now, in the book of Matthew, it's interesting, if you do a word search or phrase search on the term the Jews, there's not very many instances where you find the term the Jews in the book of Matthew. And they're all fairly neutral. Here they are talking about he who was born King of the Jews, talking about the Magi coming to worship Jesus as a child. The other reference in Matthew 27 is, now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor said to him, "Are you king of the Jews?" Right? And then the last one, so they took the money and did as they were directed, and this story has been spread among the Jews this day. All that is fine. There's nothing negative said about the Jews. The term the Jews is all in a neutral context, nothing derogatory, nothing antagonistic, hostile. If we go to the book of Mark and we do a search for the phrase the Jews, this is all you would find. For the Pharisees and the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly. And then back to the same passage we just read in Matthew, and Pilate asks, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And then there's reference in the king of the Jews multiple times in this passage in Mark. That's it. In Mark, again, the phrase the Jews is always set in a neutral, non-hostile, non-accusative context. If we go to the book of Luke, do the same thing. Type in the word the Jews. And this is all that you're going to get in the book of Luke. When the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent them to the elders of the Jews, asking him to come and heal the servant. And then Pilate asked him, "Are you king of the Jews?" We're back to the same reference that we've seen in Mark and Matthew. Again, there's nothing antagonistic, hostile, anti-Semitic, nothing with the phrase the Jews. But what happens when we get to the book of John? It's quite remarkable. There's roughly 63 times where in John you will find the term the Jews. And if you go through each one of them, and I'm not going to do that, but if you do so, roughly half of the times the term the Jews is set in a hostile, antagonistic, and derogatory context. And that is why the critics will point to John. We'll go into it and look at a lot of these next week. But this is why John gets pointed at as being the most anti-Semitic book in the New Testament, because of the way the term the Jews is how it's portrayed. And I'll just give you one example here. After these things, Jesus walked in Galilee. He would not walk in Jewry because what? The Jews sought to kill him. That's quite a different flavor and feeling than we are getting in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And this repeats over and over and over again in the book of John. Okay, so we'll pick up there next week. I thank you for bearing with me with the technical difficulties with the audio.